Hi, welcome everybody. Thanks for tuning in on one of our educational webinars for the Long Distance Real Estate Investors Group. I'm one of your hosts today, Jennifer Ward, and a little bit about me. I live in Denver and have been investing in Indianapolis for the last 3 years. And I feel like I have dabbled into most of the REI strategies out there. I'm currently house hacking. I've done some flips, doing long-term rentals in Indianapolis, and now we are venturing into short-term rentals. So that's a little bit about me. Let me also welcome my co-host, Raina Bias.
Hi, I'm Raina Bias. I live in Denver as well, and I'm a long distance real estate investor. We invest primarily in Memphis, and we do have one house in Birmingham, and we employ mostly the BRRRR method, although we do some flips as well. And I'm super excited about today's show because this is something that I think every investor needs to know and put into practice, because you can have an entire huge portfolio and it can be gone just like that with one liability claim. So super excited about what we're going to be hearing about today.
Yes, thanks, Raina, for laying that teaser in. Awesome. So our guest speaker today is Bonnie Gallam, and she's an attorney, yay, and she's going to share with us about covering your assets. So this is going to be so helpful for everybody. You should always, this is kind of like ground zero of something you want to look into when you're getting into real estate investing, because something will happen one day. It's not, a matter about if, it's just a matter of when. So Bonnie lives in New Jersey. She's an investor herself, and she runs her own firm for real estate legal advice, and she describes herself as like your I forget the term, your general counsel. So like many businesses, will have general counsel. So she can serve as like your general counsel for your real estate investing endeavors. So Bonnie, thank you so much for joining us and agreeing to share this really important information with our community. Can you go in and share a little bit more about you?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, guys. I'm so excited about doing this because when you asked me to talk about asset protection as it pertains to long distance real estate investing, I was like, you know what? There are like special considerations that long distance investors should be thinking about when it comes to their asset protection strategy, but also when it comes to how they manage their actual business. One of the things that I preach from the mountaintop is that there are actually two different types of asset protection. You probably are familiar with what I like to call defensive asset protection strategies. Those are things like LLCs, insurance policies that are there to kind of protect you when things go wrong, but they don't really do anything to stop lawsuits or people from suing you or things going wrong in the first place. On the other hand, one of the things that I like to really hone in on is what I call offensive strategies. Those are things you actually can do to prevent lawsuits from happening in the first place. I know. And so I'm going to be talking about both of those types of strategies as they apply to long distance investing in this presentation, because really that's where the magic happens, when you've got this synergy and the holistic approach of both offensive and defensive strategies working together. Another thing I like about offensive strategies is that they work no matter what investing strategy you have. I know a lot of people get turned off by LLCs, for example, because they're like, hey, I'm house hacking, I'm using FHA loans, this doesn't work for me. And so they just write off asset protection altogether. I want you to know that no matter what your investing strategy is long distance, we can talk about ways to protect yourself.
Awesome. And so you're an investor yourself. You want to share with us a little bit about what you've been up to in the investing world?
Sure. So I am primarily a BRRRR investor. Most of our properties, I would say, are student rentals, but they're not technically classified as student rental. That's a whole different thing we can go into some other time. But most of our properties are in Philadelphia and Southern New Jersey, which is where we live. I'd say our furthest one is about 45 minutes away. And so I wouldn't consider that long distance, and I don't think your audience would either, but I definitely have a lot of clients who are investing in the states where I'm licensed from afar. And I also deal with it a lot with my program, Landlord Law School, where I kind of teach how to implement this entire asset protection approach for real estate investors.
Awesome. Well, so it sounds like if it's not student housing, so then you lease by the room. Is that right?
So we don't. And I think that's why I hesitate in calling it student rentals. There are typically 2 or 3 bedroom units. We've got a few studios and single bedrooms, but we do rent them out as a whole. And so I think a lot of people who do student rentals are much more open to rent by the room. That's not something that we do. You kind of take it all together and hope that you're friends with these people by the end of the school year. But just due to the location of where these properties are, we get a lot of grad students, med students, even undergrad, once they're beyond the dorm requirement. I don't know how it is across the country, but most of the colleges here will like require you to live on campus the first year.
Cool. Nice. Yeah. Sounds like you found the good student demographic, the little bit more mature and experienced.
Yes.
Group, and not the freshmen,
we're very lucky that we don't
undergrad.
get we don't have any frat houses or like off campus like frat houses where that's going down. I definitely know investors who are in our neighborhood where they've got, these 8-bedroom old houses and they do kind of turn into like the party house. But that's not the approach that we've taken, which thankfully has worked out pretty well. That's not to say we don't have some, gross students who at the end of the year, you're just like, you've clearly not cleaned this place the whole year. But it really kind of started, that's where we live. That's the area that we knew. We invested around the colleges that we actually went to. And it kind of just turned out to be a great choice. I don't think we went into it being like, this is the investing strategy we want to do. It was just kind of like, hey, this is an opportunity that we're seeing. And it tied in really well with like Philadelphia's market has appreciated a lot over the past few decades. And the colleges have in turn invested a lot into their campuses. And so these colleges that were very much like commuter schools 20, 30 years ago are now like having an active student base onto them. And so some luck, some intention, but it's been a lot of fun. I can't imagine having it any other way.
Awesome. Well, that's good. I'm so glad like the strategy you've chose has been, really productive and fun for you still, and you're not burned out on it yet.
No, thankfully not. I definitely think there's a certain personality type. My husband handles a lot of the self-management stuff. I am the legal boss for the business, but when it comes to like navigating like repairs or maintenance requests or stuff, that's him. He has the total attitude for it. If it was me, I'm like Chicken Little with my head cut off. I'm like, oh my God, we're gonna get sued. This is gonna happen. And he's just like, no, it's fine, we're good. And I'm like, I'll lose sleep over it for like a week. And it always works out. I mean, at the end of the day, one of the things I've learned is at the end of the day, it's just money. It's just money. It's not, we're not sick. They're not coming after us. Like, it's just money. And so having that like mindset shift, which is something I work a lot on, and I have to like remind myself of, has kind of allowed me to perceive risk differently.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure as an attorney, you're very risk adverse. So
yes. And I mean, I'm surrounded by horror stories all day. Like people call me and they're like, this is happening. What do I do? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I never thought about that. Like, let me have nightmares about that now.
I'm sure a lot of us would feel the same way if we heard the stories you hear probably on a weekly basis. So
yes, absolutely.
I'm glad you're doing self-care.
100%.
Well, I understand you have a PowerPoint you'd like to share with us. So I think you have availability to share your screen if you like.
I will do just that. So let me square.
And that's great that you and your partner, or your husband, I should say, are able to make that partnership work. So, and still stay married.
Yes. Yes. Maintain your lane. That's all I can say.
Yes.
We each have our zones. He doesn't step on my feet. I don't step on his. At the end of the day, we're like, everything happened that was supposed to happen. Yes, check, move along.
Yes.
Okay. Good. So covering your assets, what your long distance real estate investing. And so you guys are in the right place if you want to scale without losing your minds, because as you build your portfolio out, it can feel like you're replacing one job with another. And that's when we're pursuing, financial independence or financial flexibility. That's really not what we're looking for. And if you're currently or considering investing out of state, And you probably got this feeling that you know that the real estate rules vary from state to state, and you really can't just plug and play the legal stuff the same way that you might be able to plug and play strategy. And so what's on deck for today? First, I'm going to explain what my Real CEO framework is, and then special legal considerations for long distance or out of state real estate investors, and also legally building out your team, because that's something that is really important when it comes to long distance investors, because we can't be the one who's unlocking the door and making all the showings a lot of cases. We have to have people around us who can handle that for us at the drop of a dime sometimes in the case of emergency situations. So if this sounds familiar, where you got into real estate investing thinking it's gonna be passive income, and you're like, oh crap, this isn't actually so passive. I have to actually do a lot of work, a lot of research, move a lot of pieces around to be able to actually make these profits. And yes, there's definitely passive pieces to real estate investing. The properties are appreciating, and if you're investing through syndication, things like that, long distance, definitely way more passive. But the reality is a lot of investors, especially if they're self-managing like we do, can find that like, hey, I'm creating just another job for myself. And until that income can replace the other job, what do we need to do? We need to kind of just get a solid foundation in place that way we can confidently start scaling and increase what the portfolio actually is. And finally, we want to protect. We want to get rich long, not quick. I'm not one of those people who's gonna be like $1 million in 90 days. Not my approach. I want you to have this wealth for the long period of time, and for your kids or for your family, whatever you're investing for in the long term. And all of that stuff we can approach with legal tools. And so my goal for you at the end of this presentation is for you to feel more confident being the CEO of your long distance real estate investing business. And quick bio rundown. As I mentioned, I'm Bonnie Gallam. I'm a licensed attorney, and I'm the owner of a self-managed portfolio along with my husband of over 100 doors between Philadelphia and Southern New Jersey. I'm a mom of 2 kids. They're almost 4 and almost 2. Sometimes I sleep. And my husband, I would say, is the full-time landlord. He's the one who is boots on the ground dealing with the self-management stuff day in and day out. But by no means is this a 40-hour-a-week job. I'm not giving him that much credit. And I'm also host of the Good Bones Real Estate Investing podcast, where I talk about legal issues that pertain to real estate investors. And I'm not your typical lawyer. You've probably never had an attorney talk about asset protection the way that you're going to hear me talk about today. And I think that's because my husband was the OG investor. He was investing when I met him back when I was in law school. I loved just thinking about what he was doing and applying everything I was learning to it. And I actually started my career doing insurance defense, which was the attorneys who, like your homeowner's insurance, would hire when you got sued. And so I saw how these lawsuits were shaking out for homeowners and for landlords at the start of my career. Hated my boss, I quit it. But I loved being in the courtroom. So I was a prosecutor locally for a few years, continued to cut my chops in the courtroom. But eventually, as our portfolio grew, I was like, look, this needs a lot more legal hands-on. I love doing it behind the scenes. Let me do it for our firm, for our portfolio, and for other investors full-time. And that's when I started the Gallam firm. And when I started the Gallam firm, it sparked something in me to create this program, Landlord Law School, because I saw that there was such a gap in legal education out there for other investors. Not everyone else was a real estate attorney like me. And so they were making these mistakes that I saw that were so preventable because they just didn't know any better. And so I created this program as to be a legal resource with templates and trainings and education to really empower investors to have that solid legal education for themselves. Because really what I saw was that they were DIYing the wrong things. This DIY mentality that I love about real estate investors, where they're pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and they're doing a lot of this stuff on their own, was actually biting them in the butt when it came to the legal stuff. They were DIYing the wrong things. And so investors who I wanted to come to me to prevent problems were still coming to me to solve them. And so I felt that it was because the whole asset protection approach was backwards. And as we dive into the stuff, now the legal meat of this, I have to disclaim, I'm not your lawyer. Nothing in this presentation creates an attorney-client relationship between myself and you or my firm. And it's merely legal information to, again, educate and empower you. And so part one of this is what I have now created called the Real CEO Framework, which comprises of three things: intentional planning, sustainable growth, and protected portfolios. Intentional planning, because you have to know where you're going. If you don't know where this business is that you're creating is going, we don't know how to legally protect it. And one of the things that I see a lot of investors do, particularly as they're starting out, is they've got their hands in a lot of different pots. They're like, I'm going to do literally any deal that walks in. And if I can lease option it, great. And if not, then I'll flip it. And then if not, then maybe they'll do seller finance and I'll burr it, and then all sorts of crazy things. And all of those have a ton of different legal landmines in them, which is fine. But it's much easier to deal with one set of legal landmines than 3 or 4 or 5 of them, because as you're learning these strategies, it's hard to even know what the red flags even are in the first place. Next is sustainable growth. Growth can break a real estate investor the same way that it can break any other business. And so making sure you've got the solid legal foundation that you can scale upon is really key to ensure that you don't get sloppy, you don't start making mistakes, because that's when lawsuits happen. And then finally is protected portfolios, protected now while you're running them, and then protected in the long term when we want to pass them on to the next generation. And so the real CEO mindset shift that I've kind of hinted at so far is that you're a business owner and not an investment owner. What you're doing is much more like a business than it is an investment. Now you may be saying, hold up, Bonnie, I don't have an LLC. This is not my strategy. This is like a side thing. I'm here to tell you that a business is not just an LLC. No matter what investing strategy you're doing, the activities, what you're doing are business-like in nature. Ask the IRS. But let's compare it side by side. So we've got a business. What is a business? It's hands-on, it's active, meaning you are in control, you can be involved in this business, and you have complete control. That's not to say that everything will always happen with your magic ball exactly how you want it to be, but you're the one who's making offers. You're the one hiring agents or property managers or contractors. You're the one who may have the ultimate thumbs up or thumbs down on potential tenants. You have control over the direction of your business. Now, on the other hand, investments are passive. Investments are things like syndications, if you're thinking about them from the real estate standpoint. But there are also things like stocks and bonds and mutual funds that you can invest in on Wall Street, because you don't have control. What you do with an investment, it's money out for hopefully money back in, but you don't have any control over that, really. It's another business really is doing something, and you're just trying to reap some of the benefit of that passively. And investments are often regulated by the SEC. Most syndications are SEC regulated, and of course, stocks and other traded securities are governed by this SEC. And so when you reframe and you see that what you're doing is actually more of a business than it is an investment, you see like, oh crap, now I've got all these departments that I can think about, which can be either intimidating or seen as an opportunity, because they're all opportunities for growth and for you to be able to scale and increase your wealth. So let's dive into the legal stuff, the meat of this. And so special legal considerations that you have to think about as a long distance real estate investor start with everyone's favorite topic, LLCs. I feel like if I had $1 for every time someone asked me a question about LLCs, I'd have a lot more real estate. And so the number one question I get is with long distance is, where do I even form it? What's the right state I should be forming my LLC in? And so the good news and the bad news is that there is no right or wrong answer. You have a lot of different choices when it comes to creating your LLC. You can create it in the state where you live, you can create it in the state where you invest, or you can create it in a third state just that has different asset protection benefits. Something you should know about LLCs is that they are a state construct, meaning each state creates its own laws for LLCs. And so the way that they're treated in that state can either be stronger or a little bit weaker than any given state. There's kind of a baseline. There's, Florida's a little bit of an anomaly. And then states like Wyoming and Nevada are a little bit of an anomaly as well. But generally speaking, what an LLC does is it creates a separate legal entity other than yourself. And some of those states will give it a little bit more protection or a little bit less. And so it's important for you to talk not just with an accountant, but also with an attorney who's licensed in those states to be able to give you a true comparison as to what is a benefit of one state over the other. And there may not be one. You may just be like, hey, these guys, they're basically identical statutes. They treat them close to the same. And one has $100 filing fee and one has $150. And so I'm just going to go with the $100 filing fee. That's fine. I mean, California, for example, has a very expensive filing fee. A lot of people choose not to file there, and they'll file in the state where they invest or a third-party state. And so you have a lot of wiggle room and decision-making power you can make there that doesn't just pertain to taxes. When it comes to creating LLCs, you can do it yourself. I teach people how to do it inside of Landlord Law School. You can do it with your CPA and you can do it with an attorney. But when you're thinking about things from an asset protection standpoint, you really do need to speak with an attorney about the differences, about charging order protections and the scope of the protection these particular LLCs give in each state. And so how does it work when you live somewhere and you're investing somewhere else? We've got this income that is generated outside of where you reside. And so taxes are paid where income is generated. And so it's kind of important to keep that in mind, that as your portfolio grows, perhaps across the country, that you may be reporting taxes in multiple different areas. Now, that's not an issue for CPAs. They're all licensed everywhere. This can be addressed and handled. But where the important thing from a legal standpoint is that you have to make sure you register your business wherever it is being done. And so say you live in Colorado and you've got these investments in Indiana. Say you created a Colorado LLC for that, but you're using that to hold a property in Indiana, or maybe you're using it to flip properties in Indiana. What you need to do is you need to then register that business in Indiana as a foreign LLC. That's how they know how to tax you. And that's how you also get protection and permission really to do business activities in the state of Indiana. And that'll be an annual registration fee, the same way that you'll have an annual registration fee for the LLC itself. Now, if you do the LLC just in Indiana, then you just have to report that income back in Colorado. It doesn't necessarily have to be registered there unless you're also using it to hold assets there or do business there as well. So that is LLCs. The next thing that is really important when it comes to long distance investors that I see screwed up a lot is estate planning. And so 10,000 foot view, estate planning is the legal process of transferring wealth from one generation to the next. It doesn't even have to be family relationship. It's just where your assets are going to go after you die. But it also plans for your incapacity. What happens if you were hospitalized or ill and couldn't take care of your affairs or your business affairs on your own? And for most of us, that's the whole point of real estate investing. We're doing this to create generational wealth. I mean, I feel like that's like stamped on everyone's forehead. Why are you real estate investing? Generational wealth. But have you actually done the pieces, the legal pieces you need to do to make sure that actually happens? And it happens easily. I mean, you can force it through. Don't get me wrong there, but it can either be nice and pretty, or it can be wrought with lawsuits and things like that. And then that is losing asset protection in many ways. If you're wasting money on attorney's fees or court costs or infighting among family members, that is a major, major asset protection risk that can even be more expensive and more costly for out-of-state investors for reasons that I'm going to go into in a minute. And yes, I realize talking about death and dying and getting ill is not a cocktail party conversation. Nobody wants to do this stuff. It's like worse than getting, a root canal done. But it is probably the most important legal decision-making that you can make during your real estate investing career. Before we dive in though, I think it's important that you understand what probate versus non-probate assets are. And so assets are classified into two different categories for estate planning purposes. Probate, meaning they go through a probate process, a court process, in order to ultimately be transferred. On the other hand, non-probate assets can skip the probate process and go directly to the intended beneficiary. Examples of that could be life insurance. You put, a beneficiary's name on that, payable on death for bank accounts. Even things like if you own property that's joint tenants, that title supersedes a will. And so those types of assets don't necessarily need to go to the court process. That being said, real estate almost always needs to go through a court process. LLCs, if you're like, hey, I'm the member of this LLC, how do I get that to the next person? Short of there being something in your operating agreement saying otherwise, that has to go through the probate process. Same thing with anything that doesn't have some sort of pre-made beneficiary designation. And it will be governed by your last will and testament if you have one, and possibly some trusts, or it'll go through what's known as the intestacy process. Intestacy is if you die without a last will and testament or without a trust that explains where these assets are supposed to go. And so when that happens, each state has its own intestacy rules that explain, kind of like a family tree, who gets what percentage based off of how close you are. Now, if you've got blended families, it's garbage. If you live or invest with someone who's like not your spouse, total garbage. Like the law very much thinks about like the stereotypical nuclear family, husband and wife, never got divorced, have 2 children, they're all from the same marriage. And even then you might be leaving your spouse out a bit. And so it gets to be a mess. You don't want to be going through intestacy. It's surprisingly affordable to do estate planning. I think a lot of people think, oh, it's only something for like the rich people to do. Well, look at all these celebrities who die without last wills and testament. Even the rich people don't want to think about it, but you have to take care of it. And it's especially true as you have all these assets. You're buying up real estate. We've got to make a plan for them. And so a complete plan would look like it has a last will and testament, possibly some trusts, usually some trust if you're going to have assets in multiple states. And I'll explain why in just a second. Also, 2 different types of powers of attorney. You want a financial one, so that way someone can control your finances in your business, but also a medical power of attorney, which is allows someone to make medical decisions on your behalf. The last thing you want is, say it's even a planned surgery, something where I'm going to be out for the count for a week or 2. Who's paying the mortgage? Who's answering the tenant's phone calls? Who is doing all of that stuff? And who has the authority to do that? Not just like, hey, buddy, can you go out to this house one day? Like, who could actually step into your shoes and talk to your lender or talk to the city on your behalf? That's really important, that you have these documents in place as not just human beings, but also business owners, that we have to have a plan for continuity. HIPAA authorizations, and then also advanced healthcare directives. Those are also known as a living will, where you can kind of say in advance, hey, pull the plug on me, don't pull the plug on me. Now, when we're thinking about estate planning for long distance investors, trusts become way more important. And that is because you will have to go to the probate process in every state that you own assets. And so if you live in Colorado, but your assets are in Indiana, and we'll add on Tennessee, you now have, in theory, probate in Colorado, Indiana, and Tennessee. And now you've got 3 attorneys in 3 states. And now you've got 3 processes where it can take months. It can take years to get through the process, depending on what state you're in. Some states have a very quick probate process and some don't. But if you put everything into a trust, and I'm not talking like land trusts here, if you put it into like a generational wealth estate planning type of trust in, say, Colorado, and say, look, that trust is now going to hold my Indiana LLC, and it's going to hold my Tennessee LLC, and it's going to hold my Alabama LLC. Then guess what? It's just sitting in Colorado. Colorado technically is the determining state for those assets. And so now we've gone from 3 or 4 to 1, which is great. The other thing with trusts, and this goes no matter what type of estate planning you're, or what kind of state, or if it's an outside state or where you live, trusts allow you to skip probate. So whatever's being held in that trust, it's just like directions. When I die, the trustee is to give it to this person. You don't need a judge to approve it. You don't need the surrogate or whatever it may be called in your state to say, yep, I looked at this, it's official, it's good to go. That's not to say someone say this isn't fraud, but like 9.9 times out of 10, the trust just does what it needs to do. There's no waiting period. And that can be really important when we've got business decisions that need to be made. Next, landlord tenant law. Good Lord, if I also had $1 for every time I saw someone try to plug and play their lease, what their buddy over in this state said was legal, into another state. It does not work like that. Landlord tenant law, and not everyone realizes this, is state law. There's basically no federal laws that pertain to landlord tenant rules. There's the FHA Fair Housing. There's the American with Disabilities Act, which touches on real estate. Those are definitely rules that every investor has to follow, but each state has its own rules on things like evictions and security deposits, notices you have to give, even what you can or can't ask in applications, and also what the rules are landlords have to do in terms of registration. And so I see it all the time in Facebook groups. Hey, I want to do this. Is that okay? And it's almost always wrong. It is just like, if someone's like, oh yeah, I can do that. I'm like, well, you're in Indiana, maybe you can do that. But this person's in New Jersey, where we've got some of the strictest landlord tenant laws. Like, you're on their fast way to getting like charged by the police if you do that. And so I encourage you to embrace the mantra. I will not go to Facebook groups for landlord tenant legal advice. Wake up whenever you think to yourself, can I ... And you should be looking at laws or talking to lawyers, not going to Facebook group. And if you're Googling and you don't understand what you Google, then you have to talk to a lawyer. Now, if you're saying, can I do this, paint color, or what do you think of this deal? Of course, go to Facebook groups. That's the perfect stuff where you need to chat with it. But I cannot tell you anecdotally how many times I get calls from people who are like, oh, so-and-so said it was fine. And I'm like, is so-and-so a lawyer? And they're like, no, I just saw it online. And I'm like, it can feel trusting in situations where it is not, because this stuff is so nuanced, even from states that are next to each other. Don't think that like, just because, oh, I'm in Indiana, and so Illinois is probably not too different. Like, it has nothing to do with that. And especially these laws have been changing rapidly over the last 18 months. And I will say even just the trend has been towards being more tenant friendly across the board for probably decades at this point. There's a lot of protections that are in place to protect tenants and their rights, which isn't a bad thing. It's just a thing. But these rules are changing faster than in some cases attorneys can keep up. I remember last spring when the moratoriums were starting to go into place, it was changing multiple times a day. It was just insane as to what was actually happening and how the interplay worked between the federal rules and the state rules. And so you really have to know and assume whatever you're doing in this state, do not assume you can plug and play and do that. You paid for a lease in Indiana, great. Now go pay for a lease again in Tennessee. And talk to these attorneys. It doesn't have to be like you have someone on retainer. Get a strategy call, talk with them for an hour. What do I need to know when I'm a landlord in this state, or when I'm flipping in this state? Are there special rules or disclosures, or what do I have to make sure I'm sending out with my leases? Because even in different states, you may have a lease, but then you may also have different types of disclosure forms, and maybe it's a lead-based paint thing, or maybe it's a bed bugs thing, or maybe there's a million different things and varieties. And so you may understand the fundamentals of self-management, and that you can absolutely plug and play. But the legalities of this stuff, I've seen it really screw over investors a lot. I mean, a big thing that I see a lot talked about is how much security deposit can I take? And there's this thing that like rolls off people's tongue of like first, last, and security. So we're talking 3 months, first, last, and security, first, last, and security. And in both of the states where I'm licensed, that would be totally illegal. And people just need to know that anything you feel like is taken for granted, be a skeptic. It pays to be a skeptic, because when you screw that stuff wrong, it's not like you just give that person their money back and it's like this. Like, there's fines, there's penalties when you mess this stuff up. Next up, contracting. Contracting also varies in every state. Every real estate is a special snowflake. It has special rules when it comes to contracts because real estate is considered a unique good. It's not like going to Target or going to buy literally anything else when you go to Home Depot or whatever. Real estate is special and it's got special rules, and contracts must need to have certain provisions in them to even be enforceable in the first place. And that may vary from state to state. And let me tell you, enforceability is the bare bones of what you want your contract to be. If it's not enforceable, you might as well be wasting your time. I've had 5 unenforceable contracts show up on my desk from wholesalers in the last 4 weeks or so. And they get all bent of shape when I'm like coming in and fixing this contract. No, we just want to use your simple one. I'm like, well, your simple one allows my contract to basically change their mind after the sale has already happened. And so you can either learn from me or you can find, yourself in court down the line. I'm not doing this because I get paid by the word, guys. Like, there are good contracts and there's also enforceable contracts. Enforceable is baseline, but if you can work with attorneys to make sure that you've got all these issues kind of fleshed out, whatever you're DIYing on your own when it comes to the legal stuff, get the foundation right, but then also periodically check in. I tell my clients you should be checking in, making sure your documents are good at least every 3 years. Especially when it comes to like leases, they're just changing so much right now that things are very rapidly becoming stale or have bad language in them. Another quick thing for wholesalers to keep in mind, if you're doing that long distance, I know it's a very popular thing to do long distance because you don't even really need to ever be there. You're trading contracts in many ways. The rules for what applies or who qualifies as a realtor or illegally acting as a realtor varies from state to state. And that can really affect actually how your system works. You can't just plug and play this stuff. In some states, you may have to structure your wholesales as a JV. Some you might have to double close, and some you might be able to do with a simple assignment fee. But in a lot of states, that may be seen as you acting as a realtor, and that's very risky business. You don't want the Realtors Association coming down on you, because anyone didn't know, that is a very moneyed group. They've got lots of money to like squash people and force them into brokerages if they want to act this way. And so it's very important that if you're wholesaling, even nationwide, I know a lot of wholesalers, they've got their hands in a lot of different markets, that you are really clear about what this needs to look like for you to legally turn a deal. Okay, part 3 is legally team building. So who's on your team? Long distance is going to require a team. Until we, can snap our fingers and pop up all over the world, you need to have boots on the ground wherever you've got properties on the ground. And whether it's a property manager or a trusted handyman or a family member who's local to kind of check in on things, you've got to have a team. And team building, whether you're a real estate investor or any other business owner, is probably the hardest part of the job. Finding good quality people who you can trust and can be there for you long term is hard, and especially hard right now, especially when the types of people who we're looking for are so in demand that it's really kind of tricky to sort out who's even good. Like, if they're available, we need them to be available, but is it a red flag that they're available? And so how do we protect ourselves so that way these people who we're trusting with our properties and giving, sometimes large sums of money to, in the case of contractors, are actually doing what they're going to do, especially when you're an investor who's not the type of person who can like drive by the job every single day. And so first off, these relationships are tricky at best. Like, you live next door to the property, it can still be tricky to navigate these relationships. And things often get lost in translation. It's worth getting basically everything you do in writing. Have a phone call, follow it up in writing. Have a contract, make sure it is detailed, and maybe you're even taking the extra steps of including photos or videos or SKU numbers of what the materials you're supposed to be using are in these scopes of work, because you're not going to be able to kind of be the one to like catch this stuff if it goes wrong immediately, which is the only way to really do so affordably. And so when you're getting things in writing, make sure you don't just have a contract with your contractor, you've got this detailed scope of work. And also make sure you've got a good contractor agreement. I don't mean just an invoice where someone's like, hey, this is the property address, I think it's going to be $60,000. I'm going to write the words kitchen, bathroom, and LVP floors, and we're just going to assume it's all fine. Like, that is not what's going to protect you, whether you're long distance or local investing. That is where things get lost in translation. There's too much gray areas. Got to have good contractor agreements that also say that they're your contractor. We need to make sure that this relationship is clear. You don't want them popping up, as happened to me. I mean, when they started this presentation saying, it's not if, but when you get sued, it's happened. I've gotten sued several times. And one of those times was someone who was a contractor of ours saying we were actually their employer and they got hurt and they needed to have workers' comp. What? And so make sure you've got these agreements and make sure you've got, the thing that you can slide across the table, because nothing feels better than that moment where they're like, hey, this is what happened. And you're like, actually, here's this contract that says otherwise. And nothing quashes a lawsuit, something like that. And in a lot of cases, it prevents it from even happening in the first place. If someone signs this thing with you, chances are they're not going to try to pull a quick one on you down the line. Same thing, virtual assistants, whether they're domestic or abroad. Get those relationships in writing. If there's some sort of NDA involved, if there's some sort of non-compete involved, make sure you've got that stuff in writing. Same thing with property managers. It's not just enough to make sure that, they're licensed to do this stuff. Make sure you've got the right indemnity clauses in there. Who's responsible for what? And if it goes wrong, whose insurance is paying out? You've got to make sure that that stuff is in alignment with what you are expecting. And if not, either you've got the insurance in place to cover it, or you get the contract to be clear to outline exactly how these things are going to be covered. So if you've got questions, I included my Instagram handle. That's where most people can find me most easily. I'm there way too often. I've also got the podcast I mentioned. And I also have this freebie checklist guide. It's like 20 some pages or so of multiple different checklists you can use for like due diligence or onboarding tenants, things like that, and have as a resource for yourself and your long distance business. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to our host if they've got questions for me.
Wow. That was so great. Everything about that was just fantastic, because I feel like I'm an attorney as well. And, it's always do what I say, not what I do. And I feel like I've gotten tripped up on a lot of these different issues from not having agreements in writing and things already stated. So this is such great information. Thank you for that.
Oh, well, thank you. And you brought up something right there that I think is kind of the point, that it doesn't matter if you have an LLC, if it's like a contractual issue, like that's just, it's not going to really cover you in any particular way. Maybe it'll kind of cap the loss, but we're talking largely about out of pocket legal costs there. This is not something that like if you and your contractor got into a dispute, your homeowner's insurance is not ponying up the money to give you a lawyer to cover that. That's like you out of pocket and this contractor out of pocket dealing with it. And so if we can prevent those types of losses, which are often more financially catastrophic than someone slipping and falling, which your homeowners would then cover, to a real estate investor.
Right. It's almost like these little things that take away at your bottom line.
That's exactly what I call it, the drip, drip, drip. It's just
right.
Like these little drips of like tenants taking a security deposit, or contractors wasting your time, or you need to go out and hire a second contractor. Like I've done that, where like you're getting through and you're like, well, this is garbage, you're fired, and now I need to start over from zero again. How do we prevent those things from happening again? One of my favorite things to do is I've created this asset protection audit in Landlord Law School, where I'm like, do this every single year. Write down what has gone wrong and what we can do to prevent that from happening again. Because that's how you get it tighter and tighter. There is no perfect fix, because we can't do that, but we can constantly be improving on it and looking at the foundation as it is now and thinking, hey, what went wrong? What do I need to add to my lease? What do I need to change to my systems and processes to make sure that that doesn't happen again?
You mentioned earlier on in the presentation that there's like the do-it-yourself, and there's some things that are okay, and then there's other things that you just need to go to a lawyer for.
Yeah.
The stuff that we talked about today, is any of that stuff do-it-yourself, or this is all falling in the category of you've really got to talk to a lawyer?
So the stuff that I always say you should really talk to your lawyer is the state specific stuff. When it comes to like getting like your initial lease in place, when it comes to perhaps even getting a little understanding of the strategy, that's probably a good thing to maybe spend it's probably under $1,000 to get all of that set up, your basic contracts and some strategic advice from an attorney. The stuff that I think is a lot more DIY-able are all the legal decision-making that you make in the operations of your business. Are we properly communicating with tenants? Do we've got the right docs for that? What does our application process look like? Is that FHA compliant? Like those types of things you can figure out yourself. And it's very doable to be able to, for example, deal with contractors on your own in a more informed and empowered way, where you understand what these contracts are, what they should have in them. I also think that it's very DIY-able to kind of systematize and create contracts around the onboarding and offboarding process for tenants. I think it's very DIY-able to put systems in place that eliminate the risk for these legal issues popping up. Because I think it's a lot of times, a lot of decisions we have to make are kind of on the fly. And I get it. You're not calling your lawyer, hey, this contractor just did this. Like, you're not calling your lawyer every time you've got a plumber or you've got a tenant who texts you. Like, we can't get legal approval for every single action that we get, but we can have this baseline that gives us the confidence and the flexibility to handle some of the stuff on our own, and to be able, I think most importantly, to spot red flags. If you can spot red flags on your own and say, hey, this doesn't look right, I should probably bring this to an attorney, you are leaps and bounds ahead of the person who just goes ahead and signs it or something. And so if you can get to that point where you're issue spotting on your own and saying, I can deal with this or I can't, that's huge.
Got it. Okay.
I was going to ask, when it comes to contracts and working with contractors, does that fall in state specifics at all? It didn't sound like you were alluding that it does, but I mean, can there be any guidelines or provisions in a contract that aren't honored from state to state?
So generally speaking, contractor agreements are much more templatable. I have a template of it inside of Landlord Law School, for example. There's certain things in there where I have like a little note, hey, look this up. But it's nothing that is crazy pants. The bigger thing I think that comes to customization with contractor agreements is making sure you've got that scope of work tight. That's not something that is templatable because it is literally unique to every single property and every single rehab that is being done. And that's where a lot of the understanding of like, hey, what does a good one even look like? I think a lot of people have just never even seen that. And I think some of it has to do with, I'll stop my share real quick. Some of it has to do with us as investors. We're kind of always looking to save on the bottom line. And sometimes that means we're looking for like the cheapest contractor. And a lot of times these are not guys who are going to give you like a 15-page proposal. And so maybe it's up to you to provide that 15-page proposal. And you may not know everything that needs to go in there. But if you can say, hey, this is what I'm expecting to go on in this room. Here's the materials list. This is what I need to go on in this room. Here's the materials list. You're in a much better position to like not have issues pop up. One of the things, that I teach to put in like the contracts is like, what's the draw schedule? I mean, that's really where a lot of the problems pop up between contractors and investors is, what are the periods where we're getting paid? What is the amount? Because you just say, hey, this is the amount that's due. I'll give this to you up front. And then suddenly they're coming to you, hey, I need more money to go buy stuff. And you're like, well, I didn't think I was owing you anything else until the job was done. Mm-hmm. And when it's getting to the point where you're like, oh, well, I thought this, and they clearly thought that, the best thing to do is to point to it in black and white in writing on a piece of paper that this is the order things are going to be done. And this is the order they're going to be paid in. And then if you are to deviate from that, fine. Do a change order. It's not a big deal. Let's just say, hey, look, plumbing is backed up. So we're actually going to start with the electrical stuff. We're going to switch a reel. This is what payments due now. That payments due later. Fine. And when you have like those templates and those things that you can handle yourself, hands down, I have no question that you guys can handle this stuff. Then you're eliminating a big risk of that relationship going south or even just falling off the rails. Like sometimes you just have like a contractor who's doing a great job and they suddenly stop showing up. Like they got another job and now they're balancing the two jobs, which isn't like a bad thing so long as they keep meeting the deadlines they signed with you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm also like to touch on when you said about, there's some things when we were talking about, there's some items you want to seek legal advice and then some things you might be able to figure out on your own. I would probably argue that when you're very first starting out, you probably should seek legal advice from the beginning, because I fear I definitely fell into this category of you don't know what you don't know, mm-hmm. And so it's like, yeah, it might seem like it's something you could figure out on your own, but in the whole legal realm, if you don't work in it, you don't know what you don't know, and if you actually needed to seek advice or not. So I would highly encourage anybody who's just getting into real estate investing to seek legal advice, do a consultation with an attorney, figure out what you should be, coming back to them for, or things that, areas that they could probably do on their own. And so it sounds like your course would be like a really good fit for that, for sure, for anybody at any stage, really. So.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that I see with that kind of a situation is that sometimes people have a false sense of confidence. They've used this lease, or they've kind of had this relationship with a partner or with a contractor before, and it hadn't gone wrong. And so they have this approach, like if it's not broken, it doesn't need to be fixed. Well, you don't want to wait for it to be broken in order to be fixed. I say that there's no cheap legal mistakes. There's just none. Once you need to start getting, hourly attorneys in the door, you can probably attest to that right now. There's not a whole lot that gets done cheaply. And so if we can just prevent this stuff in the first place, I say be proactive, not reactive. And that may mean fronting a little bit more on the upside rather than waiting for things to go wrong on the downside, because you don't want to learn that way. You don't want to learn through making mistakes. You want to learn by understanding what these red flags are, knowing what you can handle, and knowing when you need to call in the big guns.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, looking at real life cost comparison, it's like, let's say you spent $1,000 on a contract with an attorney. Sure, that seems like a lot, but when you actually get into the meat of it and you're dealing with a contractor, and let's say you don't have, a contract, you're then looking, if you want to, pursue a lawsuit, like $10,000.
I mean,
it's like
initial retainers are at least $5,000, and that's like the cheap attorneys near where I am. And so we're talking initial retainer of $5,000. We're probably talking an hourly bill of $400 to $500 an hour for a litigator. And then we're also, my thought is asset protection is not always just like, how much money do I need to not spend? It's also like, what's 1 month of holding costs? If I can prevent 1 month of holding costs, or if I can prevent one eviction, or if I can prevent 1 month of, or like being able to legally retain a security deposit when I need to, like all of that stuff is usually over $1,000. And so it very quickly is just like, look, if I can just tighten this up front, you may not be able to even recognize the savings when they happen.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
So, sorry, go ahead.
Nothing. Go ahead, Raina.
So on this whole topic of, consulting with an attorney, consulting with potentially a good attorney, obviously, because, they run the gamut, good and not so good attorney.
Yes.
How do you,
anything else?
Right. How do you suggest people go about finding attorneys? I mean, do you do a Google search, or like, what do you do?
So when it comes to real estate investors, my best tip is to network and see who other people are using. That's a baseline. See who's, showing up at REIA events, see who's local, that, if you've got other investor buddies, who they're using. The other thing, and I cannot stress this one enough, especially coming from an estate that I'll say is not an attorney state, you don't need to close with an attorney in either of the states where I'm licensed, is you don't get a lot of real estate specialists in a lot of states. And so you want to talk with them. How much of your practice is real estate? For me, it's 100. I can say that without a bat. But a lot of these people are doing, they'll do real estate, and then they'll do divorces, and then it's because it's a consumer area of law. And so they'll do things that are like the lawyer down the street that you want them to do. And so you want to make sure you've got someone who is a specialist. You also want to ask them, especially if you're doing something that is, I'd say, probably more complicated than flipping, which is the least complicated only because you're not dealing with landlord tenant law, is what percentage of your clients are investors? What type of services do you provide them? What does it look like building a relationship with someone? And I get those calls from clients a lot where they're like, hey, this is what I'm looking to do. Do you have other clients who have done that before? Are you familiar with it? Because I have people who are like, oh, I was told I can't do that. I'm like, why would you be told to do that? Oh, they said it's too risky. I'm like, well, my perspective on this stuff is that it's not my job to eliminate your risk. It's my job to explain it to you and you to make the decision if you're comfortable with that or not. So, all of investing is risky. And it's not for me to say, oh, a 6% cap rate is the minimum you should be doing to go under contract for. That is not my job as your attorney. My job for you as your attorney is to say, hey, look, we've got these tenants in here. This one's not paying. This is how it could play out after closing. These are what your options are right now. Are you comfortable with that or not? And then they can make these informed decisions on their own. You want someone who's going to empower you and educate you to make these decisions on your own and not substitute their own judgment for that. That being said, if something's illegal, you want someone to tell you that. You don't want someone to like cut the corners on that stuff. But generally speaking, so long as what you're trying to do is legal, you want someone who will be able to be more of a guide than like someone who's just saying like, I'm going to throw you over my shoulder and I'm just going to carry you to the closing line and you're just not even know what happened. You're just going to hit it and you'll be happy because you got there and not because you have any real understanding of what happened.
Yeah.
I worked with those attorneys before I started my own firm. And that was like a big issue that I had where I was just like, what is Like I didn't even understand what was going on. And there was just like, and then it would be like a surprise bill at the closing table. And I'm like, ah, how did that happen? And so also if you can find someone who will flat rate, that was one thing when I opened my doors, like I will flat rate everything. Even my course, I think is very affordable for like the amount of content that is in there, because I'm like, I need to be able to project the same way I need an estimate from a contractor. I need to know what this is going to cost from an attorney. And it can't just be like, oh, well, when I get in there, I'll figure it out. Like if you've been doing enough of this, you should be able to either give a flat rate or a very tight ballpark.
I agree. Thank you for taking the flat rate approach.
It just, I mean, I hated it. I'm like, I'd rather be a little bit more expensive and flat rate it, and you just know what you're getting into than just saying like, I don't know, like my minimum, it's usually 3 or 4 hours, but if things go wrong, it can be 10 hours. And then you're like, well, man, I thought this was going to be $1,000 and now it's $4,500. And you're not going to not pay your lawyer's bill. So it just puts an uncomfortable dynamic, I find. Also, one of the things I find with hourly before I started my firm is I didn't want to call my lawyer. I was just like, well, if I call him, it's 50, he's going to bill me a minimum of 15 minutes and he bills at $350 an hour. And so it's going to be like $100 for like this quick call that I have. I'll just figure it out myself. And so I'm like, how do I eliminate that? Because if I truly want you to be proactive and not reactive, you need to not be afraid to call me.
Right.
You just need to be able to say, hey, I've got this relationship with you. Can I call you? Or maybe and I'm still working on what that looks like perfectly. Do we have a membership? Do we have can you buy a call package with me for a discounted rate? What does that look like in a way that it's accessible for real estate investors and makes them say, you know what, I've got this. I have the resource I can turn to.
Yeah.
Love that. I love that because I think the old way of doing things was this very old, like bill by literally 6-minute increments.
Yeah.
Bill out, which is what even is that?
It's a temp. I billed at that before because it was a nightmare.
Terrible. And then now switching it, because I think that there's a younger generation who are now kind of, dealing with bigger name clients and that kind of thing. And what does it look like, this new real estate practice, and how does that actually benefit the clients? I love the flat fee. I love the subscription model, all of that.
Yeah, I think it definitely needs a different fee structure. And I think the other thing that has been a shift, and coronavirus has kind of pushed this along, but there's definitely some old birds still out there. So talk with them about it, is I'm now a completely virtual practice. I do not need to have an office to be able to get anything done. I can show up on Zoom like this. I can run through a contract with a client. They can see everything. We can ask questions. We can live edit it together. This doesn't have to be where you need to take PTO and drive an hour to be with your attorney, which also gives a lot more flexibility, because as long as I'm licensed in your state, I can work with you. And so finding someone, and that's my hesitation with Google, because sometimes Google will just show you whoever is the closest to you. You want to find whoever is the best in your state and say, how can I work with you? Because these rules are statewide. I mean, short of you doing like land use work, land use, you want to go really local. What I'm talking about is like zoning type of work. If you need a variance, you want to find someone, because I was about to curse. That stuff is very political. And you need to have someone who's like in with the mayor basically, and in with the planning board. But otherwise, this stuff it's state law. We can all handle this for you. And so if you can find someone who can work with you in a 21st century manner, we're out there, I promise. And just keep your eyes peeled for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely source that out and do your research and network. I think that's the best way to find any sort of service or trade that you need in your business, which brings up, I'm really happy that you differentiated business versus investing, because we're coined real estate investors, right? And I think that gets lost that we are a business too. I mean, that's what the foundation is. We are a business. If you're getting into real estate investing, unless again, you're doing the syndication route, or not being the syndicator, but just participating with one, it's not passive. There's tons of work that's involved. And so you have to treat it like a business. And, our last educational webinar, we brought up about having a business plan, and I think with every business plan, you do research on what your startup costs are going to be. And I think adding, legal advice, seeking consultations with attorneys and getting the correct contracts in place and leases in place or whatever you have, you need to be thinking about that before you step foot, or write up a contract to buy. You need to have figured out what kind of cost you're going to have to even get to that point. And definitely legal should be one of them. In the little time we have left, I know probably a really popular question, because I see it pop up all the time on those Facebook groups, right? Where they're asking these legal questions.
Yes.
Should I get an LLC or an umbrella policy?
Both. There you go. So I tell my clients, look, if you are financing and if you can afford to purchase properties with an LLC, there's nothing like it that will compare to it. It does something different than insurance does. It isolates assets and it isolates risk. Insurance policies don't necessarily do that. And you also need to make sure you've got the right kind of umbrella policy anyway. Some of them will exclude business activities. And so you need to make sure that basically everything you're doing is covered. That may not cover, like the contractor dispute, or in fact, I know it's not going to, but what happens if there's, an allegation of someone slipping and falling on a rental property because you didn't like shovel or something like that? Is that a property management activity? Is that just the holding of an asset activity? It may cover you in some respects as an owner, but maybe not as the actor in it. And so there's a lot of things you have to kind of be aware of in terms of the limitations of insurance. If you can do both, I definitely suggest you do both. It's after the startup costs, which if you do it on your own is usually a few $100s or less to be able to, create your LLC, register at state and federal level, and then maybe $100 or $200 a year on that annual registration. You can't beat that bang for your buck in terms of the asset protection. Yes, you still have to make sure you're operating as an LLC properly. It's not enough just to create and check the box. I see that happen all the time, and that's where you're setting yourself up to pierce the corporate veil. It's happened. I've done it to an investor. It's not pretty unless you're the one, piercing the corporate veil, in which case you're like patting yourself on the back for like doing a law school achievement. But the reality is that you ideally want to have both, but they act in a similar respect. They're both what I call like that defensive asset protection. They're there to catch you when things go wrong. And so making sure you've got as much of that as you can, balanced with the offensive stuff, the good contracts, the estate planning, the long-term, kind of business planning. So you even know how you need to be protecting yourself, knowing which way you're going is really key.
Yeah. I mean, so a little bit of a story about me. I know we talked about this before when we were doing our initial introductions to have you come on, but, last year or a little over a year ago now, I signed up with one of the, I guess, more known legal advising teams, Anderson Advisors. So and they set me up with this whole spider web of entities, which like only until now am I starting to finally understand. And, but I think some of it was premature. And I probably should have waited until I was more involved, my business evolved more. I mean, and I guess where I'm going with this is the question, like, can you do too much too soon? Is there like a balancing act you should follow?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to name names, but I think that there is a balancing act. I think some people really feel like they can't scale, they can't grow, they maybe shouldn't even start investing until they can have these, land trust, LLC, convoluted systems in place. And the opportunity cost of that is a lot. It's a lot to kind of hold you back, thinking that like, I'm too afraid to get sued because I don't have, the Wyoming LLC that's inside of a land trust that's holding my Pennsylvania LLC that holds the asset there. Like it can be a lot. And I see that stuff is really like the cherry on top. If you don't have the ice cream of the offensive stuff, and then maybe the whipped cream of really good insurance policies, and then maybe some sprinkles, which are like a normal LLC. Like those are totally fine. Like, don't get me wrong. Normal LLCs do the same thing as Nevada or Wyoming LLCs do. There's just less public info that is available. That's really the distinguishing factor between like those, like, I'll say like brand name LLCs. my thought process is, and look, everyone can take a different approach to it. I don't mean to implement my risk tolerance for someone else's, is I look at what does every other business do? What is Amazon doing? What is the hospital doing? Like these companies that get sued multiple times a day, what are they doing? I can tell you that they're not in a Wyoming LLC and they're not in a land trust. And so the goal of this should never be to hide from risk. It should be able to move forward confidently. I feel like those types of asset protection strategies are like they scare you. And when you're scared in real estate investing, you're not growing. And so I'd rather you just be like, hey, I've got these tools, I've got the foundation, now let's have at it. And it doesn't need to be this whole extra thing. If you want to have the extra thing, that's great. But like I said, it's the cherry on top. And another thing I say, people are like, I don't want them to be able to find me to sue me. And I'm like, what? Like you can get sued in absentia. That was like that whole logic just never resonated with me. Like if someone truly gets hurt on your property, if you think that someone is not going to find you or not be able to sue you, you're wrong. You want to be able to say, hey, insurance company, someone got hurt on my property. I think we need to make a claim and I need this legal defense in place. That's okay. That is okay. People get sued all the time and they survive and their insurance covers it. And then maybe their umbrella insurance covers more of it. But being sued isn't something you have to be like dodging at like 100%. It's like people want this bulletproof asset protection. Well, bulletproof asset protection doesn't exist because you can have the Wyoming LLC in the land trust in this and that, and still have a partnership dispute or still have a contractor dispute or still have tenants walk out on you. Like that's all asset protection. And so if you're not covering all of that drip, 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 drip that Raina had said earlier, then it's the cherry on top. We're really talking about like the remote situations where we're trying to prevent the remote from happening, which may still happen anyway, which is the lawsuit. If someone gets hurt, someone's going to get sued. Period.
Yeah. So run your business ethically. And definitely put those foundations in place. Yeah. And I mean, like when I see those comments of like, oh, just do an umbrella policy, I'm like, yeah, that, I don't know, like maybe I would have thought that would have been sufficient if I just had like the 1 or 2 rental properties, but now I've advanced and I'm flipping, I'm dealing with contractors. And even if you had rental properties, you will need occasional maintenance and rehab, and you're dealing with contractors that might require a contract, so
Yeah.
it's like, that's not going to cover you.
And the other thing is that's very growth limited. Like if you're thinking about that, like there's only so many, mortgages you can take out in your own name. And so unless you're like Dave Ramsey and like buying this stuff up all cash, like you're going to need to take a commercial loan. You're going to need an LLC. You're going to need to do all that kind of stuff. And so let's plan for like the long term. Where do you see yourself? Do you see yourself holding a serious portfolio? Well, I don't know any investor who has a serious portfolio that's not in LLCs. Period. The other thing you have to think about with LLCs is if you change your mind, it can be expensive to do it later. You might have to pay transfer tax on that. There could be other implications, attorneys, deeds, all that kind of stuff. It adds up. Like you can pay, I don't know, a few $100s to create an LLC now. And yeah, it's going to be a little bit more higher interest rate. And it's going to be, a little bit, different loan terms, but it's the game. It's the game. And that's all I can say. It's like you can either fight it now and deal with it later, or you can deal with it now. And there's no right or wrong. Look, if you want to start off, I've got plenty of clients who, are repeat house hackers. They buy FHA, they live in this duplex for a year or two, then they go buy a triplex and they go do this. That's fine. But they're going to hit a limit. They're going to hit a ceiling and they're going to have to pivot. And for now, they're doing the insurance policies. That's not to poo-poo on these things. There's a lot of value in them, but they're to hold them as an equivalent is not the case.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, I know probably you wouldn't want to share this, and it's not to say that this is, perfect advice, and you always want to check with a lender as well. But, everybody's scared of opening up the LLC because they are trying to get a mortgage in their name. And I've been told by several lenders that like those banks, they're not going to do the due on sale clause if you transfer your title from your personal name to an LLC. But that's not to say that's going to be the case every time, but that's been my experience of what I've been learning from talking to lenders in the communities.
Yes. As a lawyer, I want to say you're violating the terms of your mortgage.
Yes.
Have I seen it happen? yes, I have seen commercial notes get called. Residential, less so. It's kind of the boogeyman, but it's no guarantee. And so you kind of have to be ready to say, like, look, when they call a note, it's not like I need the money tomorrow, but it is like I need the money in 30 days. And so you've got to be prepared for that. Have that cash on hand, have a hard money lender, whatever the case may be, you need to be prepped for that. And the other thing you need to think about is that we've been in a depreciating interest rate market for a really long time. In a lot of cases, it doesn't benefit these lenders to force you to refi. For what? To force you into a lower interest rate? Even if it's a commercial. I mean, some people were at like 4 or 5% on their primaries. Now they're 2%. And so commercial now is even in the 3s. And so why would they force you to refi? They're making more money off of you now. But if that was to change, which it can't go to 0. And so eventually it's going to start creeping back up. And it has started creeping back up over the last year. I mean, we were closing properties at 2.75% at the beginning of the year. Now we're over 3 on primary residences. And so it's definitely creeping back up. And so whatever is happening now, don't assume that it will be that way forever. I think right now, in large parts, historically the last 10 years or so, due on sale has been the boogeyman. But if it behooves the banks and they will make more money enforcing it, you better believe they will pop up a due on sale clause department and start enforcing it.
Yeah, fair enough. Jen, you're muted. Jen.
Yes, sorry. I had more doorbell ring. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think for sure, always having a backup plan if you do want to take that risk, and feel it and weighing that out. What kind of risk is it for you, Well, this has been awesome. Raina, do you have any final questions? I mean, I could still ask a bajillion.
I agree. I feel like this could go on for like another 5 hours. You have time, right?
No. Yeah. And I definitely, Raina and I were talking about, we really would love to do something about estates, and doing that planning, and especially as it pertains to your real estate. So maybe we can convince you to come back and join us in doing a more of a deep dive on that. Cause I personally going through it for my dad who passed 3 years ago. We're in probate, and it's still happening. So I have tons of, things to say about that. So
right, but I mean, in a sense, it's good that you've seen that, so you kind of know, like, this is what option A can look like. Like, let's make sure we got option B on lock.
And that's why we have a trust now. Yay! Pat on my back.
Good.
Still got to transfer everything into it, but we started. It's a lot. Yes. Well, thank you so much, Bonnie. This is awesome. I know this is going to be such a value add for our community. And I can't wait to have you back, and definitely encourage everybody to go on your podcast, Good Bones Real Estate. Is it investing or investors? Yes. Investing. Yep. Good Bones Real Estate Investing. And then how can they reach you again if they want to contact you directly?
Sure. So my assistant probably hates me for this. A lot of people connect with me on Instagram. It's not perfect because then all I do is feed them to her, but it's where I love to play. I share all sorts of like behind the scenes things. As things go wrong, I'm like, oh, I have to share that with everyone. And so that's Bonnie Gallam ESQ. It was on an earlier slide. So just like, if you can replay, just go back to that last slide. And then also I had that checklist as well.
Awesome.
Great. I'm definitely going to download that checklist.
You got that link in bio thing.
Yeah. We'll be sure to add that in the notes when we air this recording. So
I can drop.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. I hope you have a lovely day, and we look forward to having you back maybe in a few months or so to talk about that estate planning.
I would love it. I could talk for hours about that as well.
I know. We could do so many sessions. That's why you have a podcast, obviously.
Exactly. I'm like, I need more space to do this, guys.
Yeah. All right. Well, you have a lovely day. Thank you so much, ladies.
Thanks you.
So much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.